Hi, everybody, and welcome again to our webinar series. Today we are back at Kadlodice First Nations here in Hay River, and it's very exciting to have the Richmond Oval and Evan today talking about nutrition, and I think I'll just leave it over to you there, Evan. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Thorsten. So I'll just share my screen, pull my slides up. Let me know if this doesn't show the way we're expecting, but
we see it all.
Looks good to me. So hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Evan Bexbury. I'm the registered sport dietitian at the Richmond Oval from Vancouver, British Columbia. And we're just going to carry on with the second part of our two-part series on sport nutrition. So if you watched the first part, you'll remember we talked about these 7 ways that nutrition can help improve your table tennis game. It's not necessarily exhaustive, but I would highly recommend going back and watching the first session if you haven't already. In the first session, we talked about breakfast and how we wanted to try and start fueling up at the very start of the day. We talked about hydration, which we'll touch on again today as well. And then today we're going to focus on pre-training. So how do we top up our energy levels before a training session or before a competition? And we'll talk a bit about recovery. So how do we make sure we're fueling up after a session to make sure that we're coming in strong for the next day? So we talked about 4 components of an athletic breakfast, and this will apply to most of the meals throughout your day. We talked about protein as that structural component to build and maintain muscle. We talked about carbohydrates, which is the energy that you need to move those muscles around. We talked about trying to include whole grains to bring us that fiber nutrient, which helps give us a nice, flat, long-lasting energy source. And the 4th component was water. So helping us rehydrate with every meal. So let's get into pre-training. How are we going to set ourselves up for success in a training session or a competition? So surprise, the hydration pops up again. We talked about hydration at breakfast. And like I said, this continues all day. So every meal, and probably even outside of meals, we recommend drinking some water. We talked about the benefits of staying properly hydrated in the first session, and I think it's obvious to most people that just hydrating at breakfast would not be enough to keep you going for the whole day. So this continues at every meal. And the pre-training meal is really kind of focused on carbohydrates more so than protein. So muscle fatigue is something that can happen if we don't have enough carbohydrates. It's probably the main thing people think about. But also we talked in the first session a bit about how your brain really likes carbohydrates as an energy source, and how although you don't necessarily think about using your brain during a competition, concentrating on ball spin, on making your next shot, and on coordinating your limbs to get your paddle into the right position for the shot you want to make, all of those tasks require your brain. So you can understand then how having a happy, well-fueled brain would help your performance. So as I've said, carbohydrates is the energy nutrient that's going to help energize your muscles. And so there are guidelines to help you figure out exactly how many carbohydrates you should eat based on your weight and based on kind of how far ahead of your training session you're going to be eating. So the math is 1 to 4 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight, 1 to 4 hours before your training session. So let's break that down a little bit. The example I've used is an 80 kilogram athlete. And if you wanted to get to the 1 gram per kilogram of body weight, this is the kind of amounts of food that you would need to eat to get there. So we can see here 6 cups of milk would get you to 80 grams of carbohydrates. 3/4 of a cup of dried fruit would get you there. 1.5 bagels would get you there. 3 bananas, or 4 tablespoons of honey would all deliver 80 grams of carbohydrates. Again, if you're an 80 kilogram athlete, this would be your kind of lower end of the target that you want to shoot for in your pregame meal. If you weigh less or more than 80 kilograms, you'll of course have to adjust this to suit your own body. So we talked a bit about breakfast timing on our first session and how we have about a 2-hour window to try and get some breakfast into our bodies to energize us for the day. And now we're adding the second piece of our timeline, this 1 to 4 hours before training as the target to get your pregame meal in. Of course, if you have early training, these might overlap. Breakfast might be your pregame meal. So there's some adjustments that would have to be made, but assuming you had an afternoon training session, this is what it might look like. So notice that there is a range of when you could eat your training meal, and that would impact how much food you'd want to eat in this meal. So if you're eating 4 hours before, an 80 kilogram athlete will want to shoot for that higher target of about 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram, which would be 320 grams. So I think it kind of makes sense as to why you'd want to eat so much more food, is because this energy will have to carry you 4 times longer than if you ate 1 hour before. So foods that have fiber in them might be good choices. We talked about that long-lasting energy from fibrous foods. Other things that are a little tougher to digest, like fattier food items that have more protein in them, those might be better choices if you have a lot more time to digest. Whereas if you're eating just 1 hour before your training session, you're going to want to shoot for that lower end of the target of 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. So again, if you're 80 kilograms, that's 80 grams of carbs. And you'd want to probably choose simpler foods that don't have as much fiber, don't have as much fat, and don't have as much protein. So foods like bananas, honey would digest a lot quicker. And in that way, we're making sure that we feel comfortable when our training session or our competition starts. Notice that there is a gap of about 1 hour between when we're eating and when we're training, and this is to give us that time to digest. So ideally, we're feeling nice and comfortable, but we're also fueled up for our session. So I talked a bit about stomach upset and how to minimize it by avoiding foods with fiber, fat, and protein for eating kind of closer to competition time. Another strategy that works quite well is to choose foods that are already kind of in a liquid form. So a smoothie, you can imagine, is already quite blended up, already kind of partially digested for us. It's going to be a lot easier to digest than a whole bunch of whole fruit. And you can also choose a meal supplement that comes in a liquid form, like this Sustagen Sport brand product. Again, a liquid meal would probably be a little easier to digest. So I know we had the swimming team on last week, and table tennis has told me that they have multiple competitions in a competition day. So how would fueling look if you had multiple sessions in a day and you had to kind of prepare for both? So it becomes nutritionally important when you have 2 sessions that are any closer than 8 hours between the two. And there is math to help us determine how much to eat for this as well. And the target is kind of similar to that low end of that range we just finished talking about 1 to 1.2 grams of carbohydrate for every kilogram of body weight. The only difference is that the recommendation is to eat this every hour for the first 4 hours in between sessions, which can be a lot if you think about that pregame meal that we just talked about. Like, that might be a pretty filling meal. And then the guidelines are to eat that 4 times in 4 hours. So most athletes, I would say, are not eating enough in between their sessions. Now, if you don't have 4 or 8 hours between your sessions, of course, we'd have to adjust this. But the general recommendation is to start trying to get energy back into your body as quickly as you can. And that's because glycogen, which is the energy stores in our muscles, is only really restored at about 5% per hour. So if you exhausted 20% of your muscle's energy, the earlier you can get started, the more you're going to be able to recharge by the time your second session comes around. So GI discomfort or stomach upset, again, is a big thing we want to avoid, and is kind of, we want to fuel up, but we don't want to be full. It's kind of a tricky balance. So again, liquid carbohydrates can be very helpful. Something like Gatorade can be quite helpful. Practicing as well is also a great strategy. So if you're coming out to an important competition and you know you're going to be competing 3 times in 6 hours, try setting up a simulated training session where your timelines are about the same, so you can see how your body feels with different foods in it. I would always suggest trying to introduce as few new variables as possible on a competition day. So if you can choose snacks that you know work for you and are comfortable, that is definitely something we'd want to keep consistent on a competition day. If your sessions are really close together, you might need to start fueling kind of even during your first session. And this might look like just sipping on Gatorade. So again, liquid carbohydrates, but you're kind of re-energizing your body as you're going through the first session to put you in better shape for that second session. So the examples of foods that we are going to be very similar to that earlier example that we talked about, because the math is exactly the same. I will add that I don't know that I recommend choosing all of one kind of food to help you eat these targets. 6 cups of milk is a lot of milk. I don't know that you'd feel that comfortable with so much milk sloshing around inside of you, but if you took a banana with a half a bagel and a couple glasses of milk, that's kind of what I'm suggesting that you might be able to put together to get yourself up to that carbohydrate target. So if you had multiple sessions in a day, it might look something like this. Your batteries are kind of low after breakfast, or sorry, before breakfast, after you wake up. And then after breakfast, we're kind of getting our energy levels back up. And then maybe they've dropped a little bit by the time we get to our pregame meal. But our pregame meal is timed perfectly, so our batteries are completely full by the time we get to the competition. So we compete, we're exhausted, we've drained our energy, but we've planned a recovery snack and eaten it at the right time to help bring our batteries up as high as we can. Probably won't be 100%, but we'll do the best we can. We have our second session, exhausted again, but then we have this post-game meal that's going to help bring our batteries up as much as possible to make sure that we're recharged and we're building muscle and restoring our bodies for the next day's training. And that, of course, brings us to recovery nutrition. So how are we going to repair damaged tissue and restore that energy? Well, very similar to breakfast, the body is set up to absorb energy best within about 2 hours post-training. So just like breakfast, you have kind of a golden window of 2 hours to get some nutrition into you. Like I said, protein is important for the structure of your muscles. Carbs will be important for the energy. And surprise, surprise, fluids continue to be important to help us replace what we've lost during our exercise. So our timeline starts to look like this. We've got our 2 hours after waking up to get breakfast, and 1 to 4 hours before training to get our pregame meal in. And now we have a 2-hour window after training to help us recover. So the recommendations exist for post-game meal as well. So there's math to help you figure out based on your body weight how much to eat. There are 2 different scenarios to consider, and it's whether or not you have a big meal coming up later in the day or not. So if your training session is in the afternoon and you have dinner coming up afterwards, the suggestion is you don't have to eat quite as many carbohydrates in this scenario. So the target is about 0.5 grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight, and protein at about 0.3 grams for every kilogram of body weight. Whereas if you are not having a big meal later on, let's say your training session is late at night, you've already had dinner, the suggestion is that you would want to eat 3 times as much carbohydrates as that previous example to help ensure that all of your muscle stores are getting replenished. And then the amount of protein would be exactly the same. So what would this look like? In the first example, assuming you have a meal coming afterwards, it's pretty much half the number of carbohydrates that we've seen a couple of times. So 3 cups of milk, a cup of juice, 3 pieces of fruit, a bagel, a Cliff Bar, 2.5 pieces of bread. All of those foods would get you to about 40 grams of carbohydrates, which would be the target for an 80-kilogram athlete. And then for protein, we haven't looked too much at protein yet, but the 0.3 grams per kilogram that is suggested looks kind of like this. So we have 2.5 cups of milk, 4 eggs, I think it's 6 tablespoons of peanut butter, a cup of cottage cheese, a can of tuna, a cup of Greek yogurt. I'll just mention that Greek yogurt can contain up to 6 times more protein than North American yogurt. So I'd always suggest Greek to any athletes I speak with. And then the last example is protein powder, which can certainly be a good tool to use if you're in a jam. But although there's nothing inherently wrong with protein powder, replacing whole foods with supplements like this kind of takes away from a lot of the other nutrients that these other foods bring us. So protein powder is just protein, maybe some sugar, whereas there are some vitamins and minerals in these other proteins that we'd be missing out on if we just ate protein powder. So what would this all look like? What should your post-game meal look like? Well, from our example, we might go for something like a bagel to give us those carbohydrates, and let's put 6 tablespoons of peanut butter on it. And then that's our post-game snack. And then we're going to have a meal after that, so that'll hit the target really nicely. Whereas if we didn't have a meal coming, it's late at night, this is our final eating session of the day. It might start to look like 2 bagels and a cup of fruit juice, because we're going for 3 times as many carbohydrates with that 6 tablespoons of peanut butter. So it might start to look something like this. So this kind of snack is important, and the trick really is to kind of plan ahead and bring something with you to training if you're not going home right away. I find typically I'm pretty hungry right after training or competition, so it's a pretty good time to just pull something out of my bag and chow down right away. And a peanut butter sandwich travels pretty well. One of the other main questions I get about recovery is, when do I want to choose Gatorade and when do I want to choose water? And the typical timeline is about an hour. So if your exercise is an hour or less, water is going to do just fine. If it gets up more than an hour, then you're going to be wanting to sip something with some carbohydrates in it throughout your session to help carry you through the end of it. The other example is what we talked about already with multiple sessions. Some kind of liquid carbohydrate can be really helpful to help you set up for that second session if they're really tightly timed together. We've talked a lot about carbohydrates, we've talked a lot about protein, and we don't often talk about vegetables in these types of presentations, but we don't mean to minimize the importance of them. There's a lot of what we call micronutrients, so those are your vitamins and minerals found in these types of foods, these vegetables. The vitamins and minerals is kind of a motor in your car, whereas protein and the carbs is kind of like the gas. So if we're putting in gas to a car that has no engine, it's a little pointless. These vitamins and minerals help us use carbohydrates and protein a lot more efficiently. So eating a variety of vegetables would be really important to getting all of those. And I know many of you in the north don't have as much access to fresh stuff, but luckily frozen and canned vegetables are just as nutritious as fresh. So where possible, I would suggest taking advantage of those types of vegetables. I will just plug dietitians for a moment here, and just it can be a little confusing with dietitians, nutritionists, holistic nutritionists. And in Canada, I just wanted to say that dietitians are the only profession that studies nutrition for 5 years in a university, really science-focused teachings, whereas other professions, nutritionists, even doctors, obviously very intelligent, knowledgeable people, don't study nutrition for 5 years. So if you ever need anything for your athletic or personal life, I would suggest trying to find a dietitian if you can. My company is called Excellence. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me through there. And then, as I mentioned in my first session, I spent a lot of time working with athletes at the University of British Columbia and exposing them to some time in the kitchen. If you're a young athlete, I would highly recommend spending some time learning how to prepare just a couple of meals. It is kind of hard to watch really high-level athletes leave their family home where they didn't have to cook, and go to somewhere like a university where they need to cook for themselves, and they end up just eating cold cereal because they don't know really how to do it, and their performance suffers. It's pretty hard to watch. So if you have a chance, I would always suggest getting into the kitchen, try something and experiment. I have some recipes on my website that I would recommend for athletes. And as I said about vegetables, if you can get a variety of foods into your diet, that's going to help you kind of address all the nutrients that you need without really having to think about it very much. If you need any future resources for performance nutrition, I helped build a lot of the content on the University of British Columbia Thunderbirds nutrition webpage. The URL is pretty gross, but if you Google Thunderbird nutrition, you'll be brought to this page. And it's pretty much everything in one spot. So if you have any questions about any topic of sport nutrition, you can pretty much find it there. Emma's the dietitian at UBC, and she is a great source of knowledge as well. So she put a lot of time into those resources. And that's it. So we'll move on to the question periods, and feel free to fire away if there's anyone on the call besides Thorsten. But if not, Thorsten, fire away.
I will fire away. You mentioned as well, like the Norse and the limited resources at some point, and I thought about frozen vegetables, for example. Would that still be good, because we don't always have access to fresh lettuce or peppers or whatever else that is, but just frozen vegetables, would that be okay too?
Yeah, great question. And happily, I can tell you that frozen is just as nutritious as fresh. Even canned vegetables are very nutritious. So those might be vegetables you have more access to up in the north. And so that might be a little bit more accessible, but still very, very nutritious.
Oh, good. And so, I mean, then the one thing that I would like to see what you can maybe say is, like, let's say we have a competition going on, and then how would you prepare for that competition from an entire day perspective? Like, what would you have for breakfast, lunch, and then dinner? I mean, you mentioned before, like, I loved your little presentation there saying that this is the food that you normally eat, but this is how you can actually make it, like, I think was with a sandwich and so on, and then put peanut butter on it, and then some bananas. So I absolutely love that. But maybe you can just quickly say, let's say we have a competition on Saturday and Sunday, like how would you prepare for that on Friday? And then how would that all look from Friday till Sunday?
Okay, another great question. So certainly some sports benefit from what's called carbo loading, where we eat bigger quantities of carbohydrates in the 24 or 48 hours before a competition. Those are usually your more aerobically challenging sports like marathons, triathlons, very longer term endurance type sports. I believe it's anything under an hour has kind of been shown to not really benefit that much from carbo loading. I might have to check that number, but it's around there. So in terms of my preparation for most sports, certainly eating healthfully throughout those first few days, but it would really mostly focus on the day of. And so we talked about breakfast being important, so getting an athletic breakfast. I personally would probably go for peanut butter and jam on bagels or bread with some fruit in the breakfast. And then I'd probably go for a pretty traditional pregame meal, is kind of like spaghetti. So you're getting a lot of carbohydrates in the pasta with some perhaps meat sauce and tomato sauce. So you're getting a little bit of protein, but again, most of the focus is on pasta and the carbs. And then the other thing I'd be thinking about really is hydration throughout the day, to making sure that I get to that competition adequately hydrated.
Okay, good. My last question then would be, what was my last question from last time? Oh yeah, hot water. You wanted to look up if there's really a benefit from having the first glass of the water of the day. Is it hot, or it doesn't really matter at the end of the, yeah, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Just to jump back to that last question, I skipped over the
Of
recovery meal,
course.
but the recovery meal, as I've said today, is very important as well. So um, it could be something like maybe like a chili or a rice bowl, where you're getting carbohydrates from a grain, a whole grain, with some protein in it as well. So something like that might be a good protein meal. But to your hot water question, um, the biggest benefit of cold water that I found is about temperature regulation. So if you're competing and it's hot, then it kind of makes sense that cold water would help you maintain your core temperature better than hot water. So in that scenario, cold water has been shown to be a lot more beneficial for performance. But in terms of your morning glass of water, I didn't really find any evidence guiding it either way. So I would feel pretty confident going with whatever you prefer.
That's good to know. So then every time someone else says, is it really proven? Oh yeah, yeah, it's proven. So then I'll say, nah, maybe not quite. So that's good. That's very good for me. Thank you very much.
Oh, I think you just muted yourself.
How did I do that? The world of Zoom,
There you go.
isn't
There
it?
you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna check if there's any more questions here. I don't see anyone here. I see myself. That's good. No, there's no more questions. So I appreciate this very much. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what questions our kids have and how they are going to perform and what they are going to do with you this upcoming weekend, I believe. And it will be just great to have that experience, talking to a nutritionist and just learning more about, oh, maybe I should not have that chocolate bar for breakfast, or maybe I shouldn't skip breakfast in general. And you know what? Have a nice little whole wheat toast with peanut butter and some banana on top. So I mean, everybody loves that anyway. So I don't think you lose out there. But that's just absolutely amazing. Thank you very much for everything you do for us and help and support. And I'm sure that we will see more of you here in the Northwest Territories as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Thorsten. Thanks, everyone.